This is Iran. Today, we think of it as a fortress of anti-Western defiance. But 50 years ago, it was America's most trusted police officer in the Middle East. Billions of dollars, the most advanced weapons, and a king who lived like a god. Then, in 1979, the plug was pulled. In just a few months, the island of stability became the epicenter of a global earthquake. A revolution that didn't just change a country, it rewrote the rules of the entire planet. So, how did a man with a cassette tape defeat an empire backed by the CIA? And how did America's greatest ally become its most permanent enemy in the Middle East? In the early 1950s, the world was being carved in two. The Cold War wasn't just a diplomatic standoff, it was a desperate scramble for leverage. And in this high-stakes game, no piece of land was more vital than Iran. To understand why, you only need to look at a map. Iran was the Great Wall standing between the Soviet Union and the world's most critical oil reserves in the Persian Gulf. For Washington, Iran wasn't just a country, it was the ultimate strategic anchor. But this anchor was about to break. In 1951, a popular and nationalist prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh did the unthinkable. He nationalized the Iranian oil industry, taking it out of British hands. To the West, this wasn't just a loss of profit. They feared it was a slide towards Soviet influence. The response was swift and shadowbound. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated Operation Ajax, the first time the U.S. had ever overthrown a foreign government during peacetime. They cleared the path for Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, to return to absolute power. From that moment on, the relationship changed fundamentally. Iran was no longer just an ally, it became a massive American project. The Shah wasn't just a king, he was appointed as the policeman of the Persian Gulf. Washington opened its deepest arsenals to him. By the late 1960s, the Shah was buying the most advanced military hardware on Earth, including the legendary F-14 Tomcat fighter jets, equipment so sensitive that the U.S. wouldn't sell it to anyone else. To the White House, the Shah's Iran was an island of stability in a volatile region. But while the skyscrapers rose in Tehran, a dangerous reality was being ignored. This stability was built on a foundation of foreign intervention. The Shah was becoming a king who owed his throne more to Washington than to his own people. By the early 1960s, the Shah realized that military power alone wasn't enough. He needed to transform Iran into a modern, secular, Western-style state, and he needed to do it fast. In 1963, he launched the White Revolution. It was a massive, top-down social and economic overhaul. He granted women the right to vote, launched a literacy corps, and built thousands of miles of roads. On the surface, the statistics were breathtaking. Tehran began to look like a shining metropolis of glass and steel. But beneath this golden age lay a devastating contradiction. Land reform was a disaster. Millions of farmers were given plots too small to sustain them. The result? A massive, unintended migration. Millions of displaced peasants flooded into the cities, not as the new middle class, but as a marginalized, angry underclass living in sprawling shantytowns on the edges of Tehran. As the economic gap widened, so did the political repression. While the number of universities grew, so did the number of political prisoners. Anyone who questioned the speed or the direction, whether they were religious conservatives or leftist students, found themselves facing the Savak, the Shah's brutal secret police. The White Revolution had created a new Iran, but it was an Iran divided against itself. A glittering elite at the top and a massive traditional population at the bottom, watching their culture vanish in the name of a progress they couldn't afford. By the 1970s, the Shah's Iran was a house of glass. In 1971, he hosted the extravagant Persepolis celebration, a display of absolute wealth that felt like an insult to the struggling millions outside the palace gates. It was the moment the king officially lost his people. But the real engine of the state was the Savak. This wasn't just a secret police, it was a shadow over every Iranian home. Thousands of intellectuals, clerics, and students were funneled into the cells of Evin prison, where the price of political thought was systemic torture. This shared suffering did something the Shah never expected. It united his enemies. In the shadows of the mosques and the basements of the universities, a strange alliance was born. The religious conservatives and the secular Marxists, two groups with nothing in common, found a single burning goal: the total destruction of the monarchy. They were ideologically worlds apart, but the Savak had given them a common enemy. The stage was set, the fire was lit, and the man who would fan those flames was waiting in exile, armed with nothing but a tape recorder. For 15 years, the man who would dismantle the Shah's empire wasn't even in Iran. Ruhollah Khomeini was in exile, a name whispered in mosques but hidden from the newspapers. After challenging the Shah in the early 60s, he was forced out, first to Turkey, then to the holy city of Najaf in Iraq. For over a decade, the Shah believed that out of sight meant out of mind. He was wrong. In 1978, Iraq expelled Khomeini, and he landed in a small village outside Paris. This was a massive strategic blunder. In Iraq, Khomeini was isolated, but in France, he was at the center of the world's media. Suddenly, this elderly cleric, sitting under an apple tree, became a global celebrity. To the Western press, he was a mystery, a holy man fighting a secular tyrant. He spoke of justice, freedom, and identity. He didn't sound like a dictator. He sounded like a liberator. While the Shah was losing his grip on the Iranian streets, Khomeini was winning the international PR war. The Shah had the most advanced surveillance technology in the Middle East. The Savak monitored phone lines, intercepted mail, and infiltrated political circles. But they were looking for a 20th century enemy, while Khomeini was using something far simpler: the cassette tape. From his home in France, Khomeini's sermons were recorded on small plastic tapes. These weren't high-production broadcasts. They were raw, powerful, and deeply personal. The tapes were smuggled into Iran, hidden in luggage, passed through borders, and then duplicated by the thousands in a vast underground network. This was the first viral political movement in modern history. In a country where state-run TV was filled with images of the Shah, the cassette tape became the voice of the people. It was impossible to stop. You couldn't search every home for a small plastic rectangle. The tapes were played in taxis, in bazaars, and in tiny village living rooms. Khomeini's voice bypassed the censors and went straight into the ears of the disillusioned. By 1978, the revolution had found its rhythm, a rhythmic, unstoppable cycle that the military simply couldn't break. It was based on a Shia tradition, the 40th Day Memorial. When security forces opened fire on a protest, it didn't end the defiance. It just started a countdown. Exactly 40 days later, the nation would gather to mourn. These memorials turned into even larger protests. More people were killed, starting a new 40-day clock. This cycle of 40 turned the entire country into a massive, self-sustaining protest machine. From the oil refineries in the south to the bazaars in Tehran, the country began to grind to a halt. Inside the palace, the Shah was paralyzed, battling cancer in secret, losing the confidence of his generals. He wavered between brutal crackdowns and desperate concessions. But it was too late. The alliance was now a tidal wave. By January 1979, the policeman of the Gulf realized his baton was broken. On January 16th, the Shah boarded his silver Boeing 727, took a small box of Iranian soil, and flew into exile. He thought he was leaving for a short vacation. In reality, the 2,500-year-old Persian monarchy had just ended. The stage was empty. The king was gone. And millions were now waiting at the airport for a man they had only ever heard on a cassette tape. On February 1st, 1979, an Air France Boeing 747 touched down in Tehran. Inside was Ruhollah Khomeini. Millions of people lined the streets, a human wave of euphoria that the world had never seen before. The Shah's government vanished almost instantly. the generals surrendered, and the island of stability became a revolutionary vacuum. But as the cheers faded, the unlikely alliance began to shatter. The secular liberals and Marxists thought they were building a multi-party democracy. Khomeini had a different plan. He moved quickly to consolidate power, establishing the Revolutionary Guard and beginning a systematic purge of the old regime and his former allies. The streets that were once united against the Shah were now a battlefield for the soul of the new republic. By the time a new constitution was drafted, it was clear. Iran was no longer a monarchy. But it wasn't a Western democracy either. It was the world's first modern theocracy, led by a supreme leader with absolute authority. The final bridge between Iran and the West was burned on November 4, 1979, when the United States allowed the exiled Shah to enter New York for cancer treatment. Anger in Tehran boiled over. A group of radical students stormed the U.S. Embassy, taking 52 Americans hostage. For the next 444 days, the world watched a diplomatic nightmare unfold on live television. This wasn't just a hostage crisis. It was the birth of a new identity for Iran. Khomeini used the crisis to unify a fractured nation against a common enemy. It forced out the last of the moderate politicians and locked the new regime into a position of permanent defiance. When the hostages were finally released in 1981, the Iran we knew at the start of this video as the strategic crown jewel of the West was gone forever. In its place was a defiant Islamic Republic, born in revolution, forged in crisis, and defined by a deep, lasting, broken trust with the world it once tried so hard to imitate. If you liked today's video, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel because it really helps. And see you in the next one.